talking about what is Wootz. There's been a lot of attention on the material recently, here on YouTube, various other places. There are a lot more knife makers producing Wootz than there were just a couple of years ago when I made my first video. So it seemed like we should really address the question of what is Wootz. So first, most importantly, not a single material. Wootz is a catch-all term that originally was used for historical materials, and those historical materials weren't produced with just one single process. There were a couple different ways that they were made. Crucible sizes varied, furnace types varied, number of crucibles fired at one time varied. It's important to remember that Wootz was produced over a very long period of time. So over 2,000 years of Wootz production, and this was over a large geographic area. So long history, wide area. That area covered India, Sri Lanka, up through what's now Afghanistan and Iran, all the way over to Turkey and into Egypt. So there was a huge area where it was produced. So we have multiple processes, with different starting materials. Some of these started with just sponge iron, so from a bloomery process, and charcoal. So, that was pretty much what the recipe was going into the crucible. And other ones started with a mixture of sponge iron and pig iron or cast iron, so a very high carbon iron product. And this also, not only did it change from place to place, but it changed over time. So when we say Wootz, and we're talking about historical Wootz, we're already talking about a huge variation. When we're looking at modern Wootz, that variation becomes even greater because we have access to so many more materials and so many different ways of making the material. There are, however, some common traits that are shared by material that I, and I think most other Wootz makers, would consider to be Wootz. And again, this applies both historically and now, but specifically right now we're talking about historically. So, the iron was fully melted in the crucible. There is some theory that in a few of the processes the iron was never fully molten. It's a little uncertain. We don't have, to my knowledge anyways, we don't have any remnants of ingots or blades that were not fully molten. So I think it's safe to say that when we're talking about Wootz now, we mean something that became fully molten in the crucible. Next, it's solidified in the crucible. So this is not a cast product. We aren't talking about melting in the crucible and then pouring that molten iron into something else, into any kind of mold. It stays in that crucible and solidifies in that crucible. In some of the processes, they would tip the crucible to change the shape of the ingot, make it a little longer, easier to forge out, but it was still solidified within the crucible. Next, ingot size is relatively small. And this becomes pretty key, especially as we get to the transition to modern metallurgy, and which really started with the crucible process that was developed in England. And that was developed based on the Wootz process, but it was scaled up enormously. So we went from small crucibles that ingot size was generally between 1 pound and 4 pounds. There are some that were bigger, some that were smaller, but as a general rule, most of them were in that size. So, about half a kilogram to 2 kilograms. And and again, I'm referring to historical size, ingot size. There were, there were some processes that made ingots up to twice that big, and there were some processes that made even smaller ingots. But it's, as a general rule, when we're talking about Wootz, that's the size to be thinking of. And a key aspect of that is that that's a size of ingot that one person can handle. That is, the smaller ones could be forged out by hand by a single person. The larger ones could be manipulated by one person and forged by a team of strikers. And those are the sizes we're talking about. Once we get into things like the Huntsman process, the crucible sizes get much larger, and in many cases they were casting bars directly, rather than solidifying in the crucible. They were casting bars. So that was a difference, definitely a difference, but also just the scale was much larger. And as you move forward in time into the 1900s and even in the 1800s, 1900s, obviously more recently, ingot sizes, just steel production scale has increased enormously. So again, fully melted in the crucible, solidified in the crucible, and the ingot size is something that can be handled by an individual. Anybody who's done some forging knows how much more difficult it gets to work with a block of steel as it gets bigger and bigger. Carbon content of Wootz is generally between 1.2% and 1.8%. You'll sometimes see Wootz that was very slightly lower or very slightly higher than this. But that 1.2%, right around there, is the bottom end of the range for Wootz, because Wootz requires enough carbon to form carbide banding. If there's not enough carbon, you don't have that free carbon to create those carbides. If you go back into some of my earlier videos talking about hypereutectoid, eutectoid, and hypoeutectoid steels, you'll see why that carbon content is necessary. And this is also key. These were very simple steels from an alloying perspective. Wootz historically would have had a total alloy content of less than 1% by weight. And obviously I'm not including the carbon content in that. We're talking other elements like phosphorus and nickel, copper, and obviously things like vanadium, niobium, chromium, all the carbide forming elements. Silicon, another one that's pretty much always going to be in there. But all those added together would be less than 1%. Now, if we compare that to modern steels, there are very few modern steels that fall into that less than 1% category. And in particular, you're going to see very, very few that are less than 1% total alloy and have this very high carbon content. Now, the last thing that is key to Wootz is that it yields a visible carbide pattern. And I'm very specific about the carbide aspect because you can also get patterning in steel that is based on banding of ferrite and pearlite. In Wootz, the banding is pearlite, or in some cases what's called spharodite, and cementite, or carbide. So, key difference there is that in a ferrite-pearlite banding, any areas that are hardened where you achieve martensite, that banding is going to either completely or almost completely disappear. When you have Wootz banding, when you have perlite 7 type banding, the banding remains after heat treat, as long as you heat treat it correctly. If you heat treat to put all the carbon in solution, well, banding disappears. But these are the things that are sort of the common traits of Wootz. And so materials that fall outside these traits, they aren't Wootz. So you can have a crucible steel. If I put materials into a crucible and I melt them down, I definitely have a crucible steel, right? If I put steel in a crucible, melt it down, I've definitely got a crucible steel. Wootz is a subset of crucible steel. So if my crucible steel has less than 1% total alloying elements and falls into that carbon range, hey, it's Wootz. If my crucible steel doesn't meet both those criteria, it's not Wootz. If I've melted it and then poured it into a mold, it's not Wootz. If at the end I don't get a carbide pattern, a visible carbide pattern, it's not Wootz. Now that doesn't mean it's bad steel. I'm not talking about good steel or bad steel. I'm specifically saying what is and isn't Wootz. Wootz was, that term was used as a specific term. It was not a catch-all for anything that came out of a crucible. Wootz referred to steels that developed a pattern, steels that had a very high carbon content, steels that had very low alloy levels. Now, there were historical crucible processes in which the alloy levels were higher, and those are valid processes. It doesn't make them bad or better. It's simply not the same end material. So why are we talking about this? Talking about this because if you look around the internet now, you're going to find a lot of materials labeled as Wootz. And I think we need to do a much better job of delineating Wootz as that subset of crucible steel. So, I will be trying to do a better job on this, and hopefully I'll be able to encourage other members of the community, both people who are making it and also customers, enthusiasts, etc. Hopefully be able to get people on board with this idea of going back to a more specific use of the term Wootz. And for that broader category of crucible steel, also developing some classifications so people have a better idea, what they've made and how to communicate that to their customers. Right now, there's no system for that, and so everything's called Wootz. People, I have called things stainless Wootz, clearly an impossibility. Based on this, clearly an impossibility. And even much lower alloy things than stainless, I have referred to Wootz, other people have referred to as Wootz. And I think we need to tighten that up a bit. Just for clarity, now that there is so much more material being made, we need to be clearer about what that is so that it's easier for everybody to communicate that. If I'm a customer looking to buy a blade, I want to have some idea what's in there. I don't need to know exactly what's in there, but I want to have some idea what this is. If I'm a knife maker who's buying a bar of wood, buying a bar of steel, crucible steel, to make into a knife, again, I want to have some idea of what I'm getting. And as the person making that steel, it's my responsibility to provide that kind of information. So the follow-up to this video is going to actually be a classification system. So I'm going to try to get that video done here in the next few days, so it'll come out not too long after this one does. And hopefully, between the two videos, we'll clarify things quite a bit, make further conversations easier. Thanks for watching.